Welcome to the Bernie's Bootlegs podcast, where we explore the stories of successful musicians and share their perspectives on being an artist in a digital age. I'm your host, Kenny McCabe, and let's get into the show. Okay, guys, I'm here with Rick Rosato. Rick, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
My pleasure, man. How are you doing?
Pretty good. Chilling on this cold first day of December.
Yeah, man. So I'm here in upstate New York, like in the Albany area, and we're just like we're supposed to get like a big snowstorm, and it literally just started. So I'm like looking at all this like snow piling up like on my car, and just like thinking about having to like dig it out tomorrow morning. So that'll be fun. Is it snowing there?
It's not quite snowing. There's some ice rain right now, though, and there's supposed to be snow later on, and through tonight and tomorrow probably. So.
Cool, man. So I
not used to though.
Yeah, so I was just looking at your Smalls like profile, and I saw that you have a weekend coming up. Is it next week with Vinson? Is it like it's like December 11th and 12th?
Exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, man. Besides that, I mean, what's on the calendar for you right now? Like, what are you excited about to finish out this year?
For the rest of the year, I'm going to be in town for the rest of this month, doing a bunch of local gigs. So yeah, I'm really psyched about those 2 nights at Smalls with Will Vinson's band. That's going to be with Lage Lund and Obed Calvert, and also one night Jochen Ruckert, I believe. We also have a record coming out soon. I'm going to be on Will Vinson's next record. He's doing an interesting concept. He's featuring a lot of different pianists, and with each pianist he's doing like a duo track and then also some like quartet tracks or quintet or whatever. So I'm going to be featured on the part with Fred Hirsch. So yeah, I'm excited about that. What else? I'm also playing, I think a few days after that, also at Smalls, I'm playing with Ari Hoenig's trio at Smalls, which is always nice. You know, I fill in here and there. He calls me once in a while to play at Smalls, which is great. Let's see. That's kind of it for the rest of the year. Honestly, I'm going to be around just, doing a bunch of gigs in town. But yeah, I have a few things on the docket coming up for the months after, some more touring, and, one of the more regular gigs I'm doing is with Gilad Hekselman's group. So yeah,
that's awesome, man. And I'd love to give the audience some context just about like your background and history and stuff. But before we move on to that, like I just would love for you to say a few words about working with people like Ari and Will Vinson and Gilad too. I mean, all these people, maybe Ari especially because he's just a drummer, but basically everyone, like all those people you just named, have such like a deep sense of rhythm and polyrhythms and just like the whole 9 yards. Like, so maybe you can just say a few words about getting to play with them, and like, is it stressful? Like, is their music difficult? Like, what's it like in the trenches, so to speak?
Well, that's an interesting question actually. And all those guys really do come together. Actually, I kind of met and started playing with all those people through Ari. I first met Ari when I first moved to New York, which was in 2007, and I studied at the New School, and he was my private teacher for a few years. And eventually he called me for some gigs at Smalls, which is how I met Gilad. And also Gilad and I went to the New School at the same time. We kind of overlapped for like a year or two. And so I started playing with him as well. And also, Will Vinson was playing in Ari's band at the time here and there, so we kind of all played together at some point in Ari's band. And so, yeah, indeed, they all do share like a similar kind of rhythmic, polyrhythmic concept, which you're asking me, how it is to play with that. And it's at first it was, it still is very challenging. For me, maybe at first it was really tough, but Ari Hoenig was such an amazing teacher, and he gave me some really, really great exercises to kind of develop that concept and that approach. And over the years, I feel like I finally feel more comfortable doing that kind of thing, and I enjoy it a lot. And like I always learn something, and I feel like working on music in that way also it translates into a lot of other ways. So like, I can apply that concept to any other band, or even if I'm not necessarily directly playing in that way, it just kind of gives me a stronger sense of rhythm and pulse and polyrhythm. So
Yeah, man, I love it. And of course, we can definitely dig into a lot of things related to that. But just for now, like, I'd love to start off with where you grew up, because I know that you are from Montreal, and I don't think anyone on the podcast so far has been from Montreal. I spoke with Adam Aruda a couple weeks ago, and he's from Toronto. But obviously, I mean, for me, like as an American, it's just like Canada, But maybe you could tell us a little bit about Montreal, growing up there, and getting started playing the bass.
Yeah. Well, I started playing the upright about 15 or 16 years ago. Although I've played music all my life. My parents weren't musicians, although my dad played guitar he plays for fun as a hobby. And so there was always a lot of music in the house, and I basically started playing guitar as, from a very, very young age, like even 5 years old. I think I was just kind of noodling on the guitar. So that was my first instrument for a while, and I eventually moved to electric bass. And then all in this time, I was interested in a lot of like rock and blues music through my father. And then I eventually started listening to jazz, which was when I picked up the upright bass. And I was studying with a really great teacher who just like built me from the ground, like just the foundations and everything really solid. And and I started like going to some jazz clubs and listening to a lot of the local guys playing. And one of the first people I played with was Chet Doxis. He's a great tenor saxophonist from Montreal. And in his band was his brother, Jim Doxis, and also Zach Lober, who's an amazing double bass player from Montreal. And so that was kind of my first like live jazz listening experience. And I remember, Chet, he's so outgoing and open and friendly, and he just he saw that I was really excited about checking the music out, and then I had my eyes on the bass, and he just kind of asked me to sit in one night, and that was my very first experience. And there's a lot of amazing musicians to play with in Montreal that I kind of eventually started playing with. So and then eventually actually in Montreal there's a unique education system. So high school finishes, basically we call it secondary 5, which I guess here would be grade 11. And then instead of going directly to university, you have this kind of pre-university program called Cégep, which is an acronym in French, which I actually I don't really know what it stands for. CEGEP. But yeah, it's a pre-university program which allows you basically to kind of delve into a lot of different things and test out a lot of different specialties instead of just having to commit to one field in particular right away after high school, which can be overwhelming. And so this was kind of a good way to like, it's a very chill atmosphere. And so I was just getting to play a lot on the scene then, and not just, so busy with school. And I basically, I went to the Banff Center for the Arts in 2006, which was amazing. And that's kind of when I first got exposed to the scene in New York, ironically, in Banff, Alberta, because there were so many incredible musicians from New York over there that I met, and everybody was, I was kind of like oblivious to everything that was going on in New York. I was happy in Montreal, and of course I knew that a lot of the greats were from there, but everybody was telling me, oh man, like if you're looking to go to college for music, like you got to think about going to New York, and we're all here, and we would all love to play with you. And so that just immediately gave me the idea, and I applied for some schools, and I got into the new school, and then that was that. That was kind of like the starting point for everything that's happened.
Yeah, so you mentioned kind of towards the beginning of your answer, like being always interested in music and being interested in playing music from basically your whole life, but you didn't discover jazz until what, like the age 10, like 11? Was it earlier than that, or?
Honestly, it was even later than that. I would say it was around 14,
Yeah,
13.
so
Yeah.
like I'd love for you to give some context just around like what your progression was in terms of just where you started in terms of what kind of music you were listening to and then how that progressed over time, because I found that like pretty much everyone has a different path through discovering stuff. Like oftentimes people will just start out listening to the contemporary music of when they're living, so I guess this for you would be like the late 90s, I guess, like the very early 2000s.
Yeah.
So I imagine you were probably listening to music that was being created then, but like where did you start and then how did it progress?
Yeah, it's kind of it's a funny path in a way that's kind of maybe happened by chance a little bit. So like you said, growing up in the 90s, and especially with a father who played rock and blues guitar, I was listening to a lot of rock music, and like I had an older sister who was listening to a lot of grunge and like Nirvana and stuff. So I grew up listening to a lot of rock, and I was playing guitar, as I mentioned, and I played in like garage bands, like I was playing guitar in a lot of rock bands, and I eventually actually started listening to punk rock, and through punk rock I started listening to a lot of reggae and ska, and which I guess that you can see some similarities to jazz starting there, at least definitely getting closer towards jazz and further away from rock. I literally think like during that time I think I just kind of heard something on the radio, some jazz on the radio. I had no idea what it was. I never really listened to jazz before, but I loved it. And I remember telling my parents, I was a little kid. I was like somewhere between 10 and 13 years old, and just being like, wow, this is so great. And like my parents being so supportive of my whole passion for music, they just went to like a record store and were like, my son is really interested in jazz. Do you have any records that you would recommend? And then my mother came home with Mingus and Miles Davis' Birth of the Cool. So those are my first two jazz records that I listened to nonstop. I can probably recite every single note from it because I literally just like lived in my Discman back in the day. And I would just listen to it on the way to school, on the way back from school. And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good place to start, I would say.
Yeah.
Yeah, so before you kind of got introduced to the New York musicians that you had met while you were still in Canada, was New York in your sights at all? Like, had that come across your mind, like, oh, I want to move to New York, or were you up until that point planning on staying in Montreal or at least in Canada?
Yeah, I didn't really have that going to New York in sight. Actually, I was imagining that I would stay in Montreal up until that point when I met everybody at the BAM Center. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'd love for you to tell us about moving to New York because this is something that comes up a lot. Just because so many of the musicians that have been in the podcast like either live in New York or they have lived in New York or they've visited New York at least, and I think it's safe to say that New York is possibly, in fact, I would say likely the main city where like the forefront of like a lot of creative music is happening, I would say. And I mean, obviously there's like positives and negatives to like living in New York that we can definitely discuss, but I'd love for you to just tell us about going to the new school. Well, first of all, why did you choose the new school? Because I mean, there's so many great musicians that have come out of the new school. I've heard pretty much nothing but positive things about it, honestly, but there's so many schools in New York that like, was it like a scholarship thing? Was it, was it like the teachers that you wanted to study with? Like, what was your thought process?
Well, like I said, I met tons of young musicians from New York at the BAM Center, and a lot of them were studying at the new school. So everybody was just kind of like encouraging me to go to the new school, but actually maybe even the bigger selling point for me was the fact that they have an amazing faculty list, but you can request to study with anybody, even if they're not on the faculty list. And if that gets approved, with the school, then they hook it up. So that was huge for me because, there were a lot of musicians that I was really curious to study with. So that was a big reason for me.
Yeah, I mean that's a great reason. I mean, I've never heard of any other program that does that. That's pretty crazy.
Yeah, and I definitely took advantage of that, and yeah, it was extremely helpful.
Yeah, so maybe you can just tell us a little bit more about your time there. I mean, a few people that I've talked to, like Claffey, I believe, went to the new school, and the way that he put it was just like, man, I was in school, but I was scraping by, but for the most part, I was just like out at clubs, playing sessions, like studying at the school of Smalls and everywhere else, And so was that similar to your experience?
Definitely, yeah. I think that's one of the pluses about New School is that it gives you the time and the freedom to do that if you wish. That could potentially be a one of the cons if you're looking for a program that's a little more rigorous in terms of the academics. It at least at the time it didn't necessarily offer that, although I think it could offer that. Maybe it does now. And like I think New School is unique in the fact that you get whatever you put into it. So if you kind of want to just take some pretty mellow electives and just like spend your time playing sessions and going to shows and stuff, you can do that. And if you want to take some classes that are a little more rigorous, you can do that too. So I felt like I had a good balance of the two. I think I was so lucky at the time when I went. There were so many incredible musicians there, which are a lot of the people that I've formed my musical relationships with that I still play with today. So we were always just playing and practicing together and going to shows together. And I'm really grateful that the New School created the environment and the space to do that, But at the same time, there were also some incredible classes there that were extremely memorable that I still, think about and study today. One of my favorite classes was Rory Stewart's rhythmic training class. So it was a really good balance of all that.
Without a doubt. And so, definitely had the advantage of, kind of already knowing at least several people there that you had met at Banff by the time you got there. And then I'm sure that kind of just, that's just kind of how networking works. You meet people, like you said earlier, like you met Gilad and Will Vinson through Ari's band. It's just kind of, spontaneously, how things arise. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about, well, let's see here. What do I want to ask you? Let's see. I was going to ask you, I remember now, I forgot for a second, but do you remember your first paid gig in New York?
My first paid gig in New York. Actually, I was trying to figure this out. I know who it was with. It was with Curtis McDonald, who is an amazing alto saxophonist. He was one of the guys I met at Banff, and he was one of the big influencers for me to move to New York and go to the New School. And I remember, like, even before moving there, he was like, "Man, I got a gig for you right when you arrive. Can you do it?" And of course, I was psyched to do it. And it was basically like within a couple of days of being in New York, I had my first gig with Curtis McDonald's trio. And we were trying to figure it out because it's a place that no longer exists. It was a spot on the Lower East Side. Yeah, I was hanging with Curtis the other day. Actually, we were trying to figure out, but neither of us could remember. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it was awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess we'll just call it lost to the sands of time. But
exactly.
Yeah, so one thing that I would love to talk about as well is just kind of the transition from being in college to being a working musician, because this is something that anyone who's in a jazz program or a music program is going to have to deal with at some point. And, another thing that comes up on the podcast quite frequently, which is a whole other topic, but just like sometimes people can feel insecure in their abilities, or like afraid of going out into the world just because they've been really isolated, like while they're in that like 4-year like university program. And so, it's definitely important, like you and so many other people were doing, to actually, be able to go outside of the university program and actually experience like life and actually work and play. And so, what would be your advice, or maybe at least what was your experience of making the transition from being in school to trying to make a living as a musician once you were out of school? Because this is something that a lot of folks out there, I know, especially like people that are in college, like they're worrying about it. Maybe they're in their senior year and they're just like, well, shit, like, what the heck am I going to do now? And so maybe, do you have any words of advice for them, or anything along those lines?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Let me think. Well, like I said, with my experience being at the new school and having a lot of time and space to also do what I want aside from the academics, I I was very lucky to like start working even though I was at the new school. So that transition didn't just happen like from school to being a professional. It kind of overlapped quite a bit actually. And so while I was in school, I was touring a lot. Well, not as much as I am now, but I was doing a fair amount of touring, and I guess I just got really lucky. Like as soon as I got out of school, I started touring with Jonathan Kreisberg's band, which really kept me working. Like we were doing several large tours a year and playing every week at the bar next door and playing at Smalls and the Jazz Standard. And so that was, for me, that was my gateway. And through Kreisberg's band, I met Will Vinson through playing with Jonathan Kreisberg, but I met Jonathan Kreisberg through playing with Ari Hoenig. So it all comes down to Ari kind of being like, the catalyst for all this. So basically once I started playing with Kreisberg, that just opened the doors to so many things, because I started playing in Will's band, and then I started playing in Dave Kokoski's band, and also a lot of the other side men in Will's band, like Mike Moreno or Lage. So that's kind of how it happened for me. I mean, my advice, I guess for me that happened because I chose to study with people that I really not only admire and want to learn from, but that I would like to play with and potentially develop a professional career with. So I think it's important to consider that, like sometimes, of course, it's always valuable to learn a lesson, and that can be done in an official lesson setting or not. But I think it can be very valuable to hit up some musicians you admire and ask for a lesson, or at least to meet or talk, and just to kind of to get yourself insight in mind, and you never know where that will lead, as well as just play with as many people as you can. That was the other thing that I was really doing. Like when I was at the new school, everybody was playing sessions all the time, and it's really the best time and place to do that, because now I don't really have time to do that. Just getting older and having a lot of other responsibilities and touring, it's hard to find time to play sessions. But like when you're in school and you're young, do it as much as you can, meet as many players as you can, practice as much as you can, and you never know what'll come from even just a session. Even if you're just like, oh, I don't really have time, or I'm tired, like, what's the point of playing this session? I might as well just like save my energy and like do some other work or whatever. Like, no, I think doing all those sessions, and I'm talking about casual, like not even jam sessions at a club. Yeah, that too, but like, just getting together with some other classmates in a new school practice room or wherever you're going to school, and just play and meet new musicians, because then they call you for something, and for another session even, and maybe somebody on that session has some gigs for you, and then that opens the doors to so many things. So I would say that's also a huge point. And another huge point, at least from a bass player's perspective, because we have to be sidemen in a lot of different things, is to expose yourself to so many different styles of playing, different kinds of music, and just to be kind of open to it all, especially at first. I think it's very important and valuable eventually to really hone in and like to develop a specialized concept maybe. But at first, I think it can be very valuable to maybe just be a little more open and try a lot of different things, even if it's outside of your comfort zone. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, there's so much wisdom there, and a lot of different directions we could take that. And so, I mean, a lot of it for me, listening to your answer and a lot of other folks that have been on the podcast, like a lot of it just comes down to not limiting yourself. Not limiting
Yeah.
yourself in what styles of music you want to play. And a lot of it is just like mentality. It's just like the mental conversation that you have with yourself. A lot of times, like I'm sure everyone will have the experience of like saying to themselves like, oh, I don't like this music or the particular type of music, or I don't want to play with that person. But you're really limiting yourself. And the truth is that we all have moments in life where just a quick 2-minute conversation or any tiny event can really change things like in a very drastic way. And also just don't limit yourself in terms of thinking of what you can do. Like you were saying before, like when you're thinking about who you're going to study with, don't just think about what you can learn from them. Maybe try and pick someone that you would like to play with, and don't say to yourself like, oh, this person's so high profile that like I could never play with them, like all these things. Like, and it's just like mentality thing. Me and Jonathan Barber talked a lot about this, because what he did, when he wanted to play with Pat Metheny, is he just learned every Pat Metheny tune, and then like basically just did everything he could in order to demonstrate to Pat that he was serious about learning his music. But that all originated just from a mentality that he had, that he could play with Pat Metheny if he was willing to put in the work. And so I don't know, is that something that you subscribe to?
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely. Yeah. I did a similar thing with some of the people that I've worked with, like Ari Hoenig, for example. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, man. So just on like a more specific musical note, I'd love for you to just say a few words maybe about what you practice these days, because obviously it's very difficult, I'm sure, to practice on the road, especially as a bass player, because just like it's not like you can shed anywhere,
Yeah.
And so maybe you can tell us like two things: what you practice, or like things that you do every day when you're home, when you have time, and then
Mhm.
kind of and then also kind of how you manage to try and stay in the shed and keep your facility well oiled, like while you're on the road.
Yeah. I do. I actually, ironically, do a lot of practicing on the road. Um, Sometimes, if there's time, I'll try to get to sound check early and just like have an hour or two on the bass, um, which has been very valuable for me, especially as a bass player playing like not traveling with my instrument and just like having to get to know each instrument every night. So I do end up doing quite a bit of practicing on the road. Um, But actually, I would say even like half or even maybe most of my practice is done off the instrument, even at home. Even when I do have my instrument available, I do a lot of, I'm pretty notorious about recording everything I do. For me, that's the best way to have a very objective perspective on where I'm at and what's working and what's not. And so I'm constantly just kind of like dialing in and trying new things on the gig and like listening back and seeing if it works. So that for me is huge practice. Um, and some more practice that I consider practice, at least off the instrument, is just listening to music and going to shows and exposing yourself to, you know, other great musicians that inspire you and just try to absorb what they're doing. So that for me is huge. And in that sense, I'm always practicing. But I do also practice on my instrument quite a bit. Like I said, getting older and having more responsibilities, it's not as easy as when I was in college. Like I can practice 6 hours a day or something. So even if I find like an hour or two to practice a day, I'm happy. Which for me, honestly, usually consists mostly of like maintenance stuff, like things that I've been doing for years and years and years, and I've just kind of really slowly and developed over time, and I feel very strong and comfortable with. You know, it's pretty pretty simple stuff, like literally major scales and stuff. Playing major scales really slow, and you know, increasing the tempo, playing them fast, arpeggios. I do a lot of work on my time feel. And for me, those things basically encompass what I think to be, and also I'm sure a lot of other bass players would agree with me, to be the most important things as a bass player. You want to have good time, you want to have good sound. So I'm always just kind of working on those things. And then on top of that, I will do some new things that kind of change day to day or week to week or month to month, which is usually dictated by the gigs that I'm doing, the gigs that I have coming up. So usually there's some music to learn, and I'll kind of just apply my maintenance exercises to, you know, to the repertoire of these gigs I have coming up, and just like find a way to be really comfortable and really solid on this original music, which might be very challenging, and find a way to just get really comfortable on that. And yeah, I guess there's no like magic trick or rocket science. I feel like I'm doing some pretty basic things, but I feel like ironically, at least for me, doing that as opposed to like overwhelming myself with new things that I can't ever do. Like I actually feel like that goes a really long way, and I've actually done a lot of progress in that. Yeah.
No doubt. And so as someone who has primarily played in the sideman context, as we're talking a lot about, like just on like a very practical level, are there any things that you wish that more band leaders or like frontmen, so to speak, would do to make the sideman's job as easy as possible that you don't see done often enough?
That's a good question.
Like, do you wish that like music was sent farther in advance, or do people sometimes request too much? Like, what in terms of just like expecting you to be able to sight read all of their original music on the gig? Like, what are some just practical things that you think about?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, yeah, if there's some tricky stuff to look at, then I definitely appreciate it when band leaders would send it in advance. Even as somebody, I'm fairly confident with my sight reading skills, and I can usually sight read through almost anything. But yeah, I guess I would say that like maybe you can almost think of band leaders in two different schools. Like I feel like there's one school of like just hire the right people and it'll just kind of happen on its own. And so don't say anything and just let it happen. And I like that. I like that freedom, and I like that sense of trust between everybody, where it's like, you know, you're playing your instrument, I'm playing mine, and I trust you're going to do what's going to sound best, and I'm going to work with that. And so that's a situation I really love. But of course, that doesn't work for all situations. Sometimes it's more specific, and you do need some more direction from the band leader. So if that's the case, you know, I appreciate it when band leaders speak up and say something instead of, I don't know, doing it in some other way. But you know, as a whole, I feel maybe that's part of like what we were talking about before, just like being open to playing all kinds of styles. I feel like maybe, you know, even though I was doing that when I was in college and stuff, it's kind of like adapted itself to the way I play today, and I guess my personality, where I can easily kind of, I don't know, maybe be a chameleon in a way, just like adapt to a lot of different things and not just have this one idea where like, oh no, band leaders need to tell me exactly what to do, or like, oh no, I hate it when band leaders tell me what to do. It needs to be completely open. It's like, well, no, both things work. It really depends on the musical situation, and I happen to do a lot of different things, so there needs to be a lot of different ways to go about it.
Yeah, and I guess, as far as the sideman thing goes, it kind of just comes down to, I mean, the main goal, as I see it, is just like you want to be someone who the band leader does not have to worry about. Just
Yeah,
like no matter what, they're not gonna whatever they tell you to do or whatever the music is, you want them to not have to worry about you because that's when the music will, I think, probably reach the highest level when they can actually focus on, more higher level things as opposed to trying to micromanage, the each person in the band.
exactly. I agree.
Yeah, man. So you do not have that much social media, which I actually commend you for, because social media, I mean, there's a lot to say about it. Obviously, with anything, there's positives and negatives. Like, it can be a very useful and practical tool for distributing your content or your music or whatever into the world. But at the same time, it's just so much negative shit at all times. And then there's all these like problems of like people seeing what you're doing, but obviously social media, you're just posting the highlights, so you don't really see the full picture. So there can be all sorts of problems. But for right now, you do have a Facebook page. Is it just called Rick Rosato, or is it Rick Rosato Music?
It's just Rick Rosato. Yep.
Cool. So people can definitely follow you on there, and I'm sure you get tagged in a bunch of stuff, so people can see what you're doing. And then besides that, you do not have Instagram, but I'm sure there is a Rick Rosato hashtag that people can follow. And
There is There's also a Rick Rosato doesn't have Instagram hashtag.
yeah, so people can definitely check that out. You mentioned to me before we started that you are going to think about putting up a website, but I mean, there's no rush, I would say.
Yeah, there certainly isn't. It would be a nice thing to have. Maybe we'll see.
Yeah, man. I mean, I guess from your point of view, it's just like the phone rings, you're playing stuff. So, I mean, it's, you had mentioned a little bit, wanting to do some of your own stuff eventually, which I'm sure you will. And,
Yep.
we can all look forward to that in the coming year. So yeah, man, is there any final words of wisdom or advice that you would like to put out into the universe?
Ooh. Play your ass off and really study exactly what it is that you love and be true to that and to yourself.
Well said, Rick. Thank you so much for this, man. This is awesome.
Yeah, thank you, man. Pleasure.
My pleasure. Stay on the line for 1 second. Thank you again.
All right, thanks.
Thank you so much for checking out the podcast. Don't forget to subscribe wherever you happen to be listening to this. And if you enjoyed the podcast, consider giving it a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. For more episodes, please visit BerniesBootlegs.com. Thanks again, and see you guys next time.